Hasan's Toward a Concept of Postmodernism. To begin with this essay by Ihab Hasan, an Egypt-born American literary theorist and writer, we first need to understand the strains of silence in literature that he is referring to. Strains of silence allude to periods of inconclusiveness, the lack of clarity, the indecipherable, the breaking down of communication, which has been many times declared the backbone of absurd literature. He brings into reckoning at the onset of his essay the libertine French philosopher Marquis de Sade, who lived between 1740 to 1814, and his writings, which verged on the ultimate of blasphemy because it included pornography, sexual fantasies about violence against children and women, tirades against Christianity, his campaign of absolute freedom, and for being contemptuous of everything that defined moralistic and conventional thinking. Hasan pits him against Samuel Beckett, Irish-born writer who caricatured the inaneness of life in his work in a half-comic, mocking manner, far removed from the style of Sade, who is notorious for having the word sadism coined after him. The strains of silence between that kind of writing is evocative of the shock that seems to have silenced literature, keeping in context the absolute chaos that is inevitable with historical transgressions into the extraordinary. The late 19th century to the early 20th century was historically an extremely significant period. The voluptuousness of writing of Sade to the strange ennui reflected through Beckett is teeming with unsaid matter, rather inappropriately defined as strains of silence unless one interprets the phrase to mean Ihab Hasan's ironical implication of a cacophony of tempered or smothered silence between the two periods. Hasan is trying to put a finger to the tumult which he calls the phenomenon of crossroads of culture, language, consciousness, and the necessity of it to be called a precursor of what is now termed as postmodernism. For us to understand postmodernism, it is necessary to understand modernism, a period which began in the late 19th century till the beginning of the 20th century, a period which witnessed a breaking away from traditional styles and philosophies, a time which marked a change from complacence to the thought of redoing philosophy as per the thinking of the younger lot. In his introduction, Hasan hints at a precursor to postmodernism in modernism when he questions in the introduction to the essay if it is possible for the Western academia or Western discourse to isolate and define any movement which is so akin to modernism and its many manifestations in avant-gardism or high modernism at the turn of the century. He reveals a tendency to believe that what is defined and described as postmodernist incomprehensibility existed way before these terms came to attach themselves to this phenomena. His argument through this essay is to reduce the exotica element of newfangled nomenclature to an ironical admission of déjà vu in the entire exercise of defining the concept of postmodernism. Ihab Hasan has said elsewhere that what was postmodernism and what is it still? I believe it is a revenant, the return of the irrepressible. Every time we are rid of it, its ghost rises back. And like a ghost, it eludes definition. In the second paragraph, he admits his own failure to answer his own questions. He states that just as the progression of history is not always a smooth and forward march with no possibility of regressions, similarly, periods of literature also carry in them semblances of the past and precursors of the future. By naming philosophers and theorists like Baudelaire, Darwin, Nietzsche, Einstein, Freud, and the fact of their convictions having received an honest share of rethinkings and reconceptualizings and revisions, he He's only making his argument apparent. The knowledge, information, culture, philosophy, criticism are all open to amendment. And so, postmodernism, according to Hasan, is a significant revision, if not an original episteme. In the third paragraph, Hasan, by his own description, piles up names in a pell-mell in order to establish his argument about how a huge variety of thinkers, writers, philosophers foreshadow what is defined as postmodern angst. Mention of extremely important names is made here, ranging from Derrida to Foucault to Lacan to Lyotard, and then to Beckett to Ionesco to Gabriel Garcia Marquez et al. His point is to exhibit how, despite their huge heterogeneity and the incongruity of clubbing them under a common school of thought, they still display certain signs that reveal a pattern of common thought. These signs Hasan calls postmodernism. Postmodernism was first mentioned by American Spanish writer Federico de Onís, followed by Dudley Fitts, American teacher, critic, writer between 1934 and 1942. Arnold Toynbee also made mention of postmodernism in 1947, and so did Charles Olson in the 50s, though he did so with more flair than mere efforts to embellish the movement. The next paragraph is about how poets and philosophers have the privilege to be more expansive in their approach to periods and what periods contain. Irving Howe, Harry Levin, Leslie Fiedler, and Hasan himself are mentioned for their varied opinions of postmodernism. While Howe and Levin were disappointed, Fiedler and Hasan seemed to regard the movement with more approbation. While Fiedler seemed contemptuous of the modernistic radicalism, Hasan found the self-unmaking that followed literature of silence. According to Charles I. Glicksberg, literature of silence is that literature which is struggling to be born. In the literature of silence between Sade and Beckett, there seemed to be a pulsating, throbbing body of work which defied the standard run-of-the-mill quality. In that kind of work, postmodernism finds its beginnings. In that kind of work, within the folds of pop culture and silence, those of mass culture and deconstruction, and those of Superman and Godot, he touches upon the aspect of self-unmaking that, according to him, is so reminiscent of postmodernist temperament. It brings into significance that brands postmodernism. The lack of purpose, meaning, the breakdown of communication, the effacement of the self in the caricature of a Godot or a Hamlet pastiche in Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, or Albert Camus' drawn character of the mythological Sisyphus. All these are illustrations of the self having lost its identity, of wandering with no answers. Here he mentions the main ideas of his essay, which, when he talks about immanence and indeterminacy, which become the focal points of this essay in the later stage. He goes on to reaffirm what he and many other periodization theorists have had to say. The fact that in the course of literary history, one is acquainted with many contradictions. What has been avouched as fact is sometimes rethought and necessary corrections made. He provides examples of Lionel Trilling, Kenneth Boulding, George Steiner Roderick, Seidenberg, who have variedly used either post or beyond to explain what is contained a little extraneously in what they wish to discourse upon. The implication that it is a mere play on words, because both words, beyond and post, can be used interchangeably, but as Daniel Bell says, a trifle sadly, that the popular literary modifier used to be beyond at one time, but sociological compulsion chooses post over beyond. How literary and sociological modifiers are crossing paths, which is only an indication of how periods are exhibitory of mere changes or play on words. Hence, postmodernism is, in fact, re-emphasized modernism. Hasan's point is to understand the position of postmodernism and why it is debatable. The approbation of this period lies in this in its leaning towards intellectual superiority. Now, whether it receives its due recognition or is rejected as a body of work different from prior work is dependent upon the priorities, political affiliations, personal preferences, etc., of the discourse in the academia. He realizes that the relevance of this genre is crucially placed. It faces the risk of historical obliteration owing to its rather unemphatic significance as a separate body from modernism, as well as the threat of becoming outdated, as is the practice with much of historical transgressions and omissions. So he decides to list 10 identifiable characteristics of postmodernism to make clear the concept of postmodernism. Number one says the word contains in itself what it is trying to distance from, which is modernism. He toys with the idea of calling this by any other name, which would evoke the same out of range reach by considering space age, the age of television or space, all of them expressing the mode of bizarre existential crisis which postmoderns identify with. Its special drawback is that it contains its enemy with that is the word modernism, unlike romanticism and classicism or baroque with rococo. They too are extensions of each other, but at least they allow for a difference or distance by the fact that they are two separate words, however similar in characteristic or nature. Then he considers calling it the age of indeterminance, bringing forth his pet leaning towards immanence, which states that the age has some quality intrinsic or inherent within it and something which is not open to definitions imposed upon it. By combining indeterminance with immanence, he is only throwing up his own lack of conclusiveness about the character of postmodernism. Indeterminance allows postmodernism a touch of diffusiveness which defies determinate quality or clarity. So in his first point, he admits to lack of conclusiveness as to what he proposes to be postmodernism. Second, he talks about postmodernism with semantic instability, which again refers to the tottering identity of the term postmodernism. The reasons he offers for this is the fact that the term is relatively young or new and is expected of anything of youth. It contains within it the brashness and recklessness which defies taming. Again, the concept of indeterminacy enters his opinion. Also, due to its familiarity with other terms like avant-gardism or neo-avant-gardism, which are equally new and gawky, it throws open further debate as to what actually defines postmodernism and how exactly it is different from these. Avant-gardism was considered another form of hyper-modernism because of its radical, unorthodox, experimental quality. Third, he talks about the historical instability of literary concepts. Concepts evolve and change over time owing to various interpreters and practitioners. He gives the example of Coleridge, Pater, Abrams, Lovejoy, Peckham, and Bloom, who have understood Romanticism in the same way. Each critic perceives a literary age in his or her own manner, and that is why definitions are fluid, always slip and slide, as do modernism and postmodernism. But he brings in an astronomical phenomena called the redshift to reaffirm that what Edwin Hubble had discovered about the galaxy's velocity being directly proportional to its distance can in fact be drawn as a parallel to literary movements, which, depending upon their distance from each other, reveal shifts towards the red light, which can be interpreted to mean a discernible pattern. Fourth point, he says, is again a reaffirmation of what he has said earlier. History is rewritten according to each age and is called palimpsest, which is a manuscript or a piece of writing material upon which later writing has been superimposed or on effaced writing. Using James Joyce's novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, and Finnegan's Wake, and the huge time difference between the two works of fiction, Hasan hints at the elements of both modernism and postmodernism in them. He says writers can club traits of the Romantic, the Victorian, the modern, and the postmodern all at once, thus proving the redundance of periodization to a certain extent. While portrait was a Consul Roman in a modernist style, Consul Roman, which means the growth or the development of an artist in a young man, and traced the religious and intellectual awakening of young Stephen Dedalus. Finnegan's Wake, with an abandonment of narrative conventions, remains largely unread by the general public because of its various experimental techniques. He even allows for modernism to go way back to Romanticism, then to Enlightenment, then to Renaissance, and then to the Greeks. Even if he doesn't take it as far as to the Olduvai Gorge, which was the oldest evidence of man's evolution in Tanzania, then he can take it as far as beyond to the Greeks. Fifth point was that a period must be understood as both continuous and sporadic. Hasan used the dichotomous literary concepts of Apollyon and Dionysian, both sons of Zeus of Greek mythology, and completely different from each other. Apollo is the god of the sun, rational and logical in thinking, whereas Dionysius is the god of wine, irrationality, chaos, and sensuousness. Each different from the other, but the roots are the same. One seeks the authenticity of history, and the other seeks the moment where history seems to miss a step, quite unlike the progression of literary periods and quite alike the progression of his literary periods and their concepts. Sixth point is, periods cannot be considered as final. They are both diachronic and synchronic constructs, which means that they are both a study of how something has evolved over a period of time, as well as how something has been at a particular period of time. Writers and philosophers like Sade, Sterne, Blake could have in them elements of a postmodern writer, and just as they can have postmodern characteristics in them, those writers who are supposed to be postmodern by the mere positioning of themselves in a certain point of history, they actually might not harbor in them postmodern characteristics like Styron, Updike, Capote, Irving, Dork, etc. Seventh, he talks about the necessity of having a dialectical vision or a need to hold divergent, antithetical views, but yet come to a point of accord between them. Because to have a single vision is to be guilty of Newton's sleep, which means in Blake's words, the tendency to ignore the differing viewpoint. To accept only one view is to make all past writers like preterites or the has-been, the lost in the mist of time with no relevance in the present or future. He has been guilty of assumptions that postmodern is all about self-unmaking. It is incomparable. It is chaotic without a semblance of order, not creative enough. Though it is all that, yet there is in it a provision to cross over and fill the gap and make comprehension and alliances possible. To attain an immanence of discourse is an ambitious desire to remain as solid, as significant, despite its will to throw into disarray perceptions of it as erratic. There is also in it a tendency to unify, to engage with the intellect, and not to seemingly throw everything into shambles, to allow for a bit of neo-Gnosticism, or rather the blend between Christian Catholicism and ancient paganism. The eighth point was that all the above makes us revert to our main problem, that is periodization, the ambiguity of periodization and the necessity of periodization. Of course, periodization is and will be, because the flow of time brings change and evolution and with various interpretations. But to what ideological dominance can we exactly align postmodernism? That of Heraclitus, who was a pre-Socratic Greek philosopher known for his play on words and titled as the obscure thinker who believed in ever-present change or flux or becoming, within quotes. Or should postmodernism be aligned with Darwinian, Freudian, Derridian, or other theories? Or should it be left unexplored as different or as an incomprehensible trace? Ninth point is about how postmodernism is it meant to be only regarded as an artistic phenomena, or does it have relevance in the socio-political, economical facets of existence? Can it be a significant study of a sociological kind? Foucault's theories primarily address the relationship between power and knowledge and how they are used as a form of social control through societal institutions. Toynbee believes that the ideas and methods for meeting the challenges for a society come from a creative minority. So, is Hasan's concept of postmodernism of only literary significance, or is a matter of deeper sociological importance? Finally, in the 10th point is about how postmodernism is a title by which we offer our tribute or glorify or valorize writers or a body of writers, however different from each other, but in our opinion, deserving of appreciation. Or is this term meant to be severely criticized? Is it a term which is always steeped in confusions without a concreteness about it? Hasan attempts to classify what has been seen in the trends of the future of the literature of silence that existed between Said and Beckett. He can scan through the three strains of literary distinction, that is, the avant-garde movement, modernism, and postmodernism. These three distinguishing movements have seen not only leaps in art, but leaps in the human psyche and growth. By avant-garde, he lists a variety of movements like Cubism, Dadaism, Surrealism, etc., which have made their presence felt through their erratic features, sometimes allowing practitioners to delve too within and resulted in self-destruction, like in the case of the later postmodernist Rudolf Schwarz-Kogler. Pataphysics, Dadaism, Surrealism, Cubism, all movements significant of the wildness of the avant-garde movements, temperamental, euphoric, but transitory, remained popular for a short period, made a cataclysmic impact upon the middle-class aesthetics, but vanished. Postmodernism carries in itself some of its cataclysmic nature, but modernism was distinguishable by its reticence, maturity, and aloofness. Hasan goes on to list the differences between modernism and postmodernism in a very illustrative manner, where he differentiates between their characteristics. For instance, he talks about the tendency of postmodernism to indulge in rhetorics, whereas modernism is all about semantics. Where modernism is about the root, postmodernism is about the rhizome or of the surface. Modernism is about hierarchy and postmodernism is about anarchy, and so on and so forth. A very relatable list of distinctions between the two great movements. Finally, he reaches the crux of his argument, where he explains what he means by indeterminance. He has used the word to define two dominant strains of postmodernism. One of that of indeterminacy and the other of immanence. Indeterminacies in the postmodern writing is indicative of all the ambiguities that this literature is representative of. He uses terms like pluralism, heterodoxy, randomness, perversion, revolt. Of these words, sum up the cacophony of postmodern man and his tendencies. He goes on to list theorists or critics like Roland Barthes, Wolfgang Iser, Paul Deman, Geoffrey Hartman, who speak of literature as loss, perversion, as textual blanks, as that which open up possibilities of referential aberration, or that present-day criticism aims at interpretation of indeterminacy. Such a huge amount of pluralism necessitates the posing of his second characteristic of postmodernism, that immanence without any religious connotation. The term immanence means existing, operating, or remaining within. which probably refers to the capacity to depend on the reservoirs of the self, of the individuality without interference from outside. This intellect centered tendency is further enhanced by tendencies of the need of spreading of knowledge or dissemination or interplay or communication, where stands the risk of becoming a mere means of language, while Foucault speaks of the obliteration of man as only the means of a more superior network, and that is of language. That language is the immanescence, the significant permanent thing which will throw into irrelevance the creator of the same language, which is man himself. The capacity of the mind is separate from man himself, and that capacity has made possible many leaps where history becomes a happening. Science apes a self-sought reality. Artificial intelligence makes itself so remote with unimaginable leaps. In all of this, what stays as immanescence is the language, which is what conveys and transmits. Even though postmodernism exists in most developed societies as an artistic philosophical phenomena, postmodernism veers towards all that is pluralistic in nature, thus bringing about and engaging in a philosophy of distinctiveness. This inconclusiveness in the postmodern movement brings forth a diversity in the nature of transitions in society. Hasan brings to the postmodern movement more sociological significance because of the way the entire world is split into factions and groups. How the scope of totalitarianism, terrorism, frictions, and conflicts throws up new challenges, and societies and authorities scramble to retain a semblance of civilization and normalcy. This plurality is compared to the mythological story of the Greek musician Orpheus and the dismemberment of his body parts due to a conflict between Dionysius and Apollo, the sons of Zeus, as I mentioned earlier. Hasan ends his philosophical tirade against the inability to stem the plethora of ideologies that postmodernism throws up with questions as to what else is going to be constructed out of this deconstruction. I hope all of you listen to this, make your notes, ask yourselves where you have a problem, and revert back to me as soon as possible. I will follow up with the notes on other chapters. Thank you.